So it sounds like I might be getting off on a technicality, which is great because I think it would be really difficult to change all the marketing. All right. So there are, I know, many techniques, having read the book, to measure many different things. But there are two specific focus areas I want to target with you today. Those are small business metrics and, not surprisingly, founder skills and ability. For the small business metrics part, my impression from the book is that Fermi and confidence intervals are important techniques, maybe the most important techniques for that particular set of metrics. I've got 4 questions for you. First of all, do I have that right? Are those the two that you would put kind of as the best way for measuring small business metrics?
Yes, certainly. When you refer to Fermi, we're talking about Enrico Fermi and how his name was associated with decomposing difficult estimates, right? So if you're trying to figure out what your demand might be for a particular market, you're opening up a bakery in an area, and you try to figure out, well, what would my monthly demand be? Well, you might start with, well, what's the population of the area? How often would they visit a store like mine? What percentage of the population would, frequent a bakery? And how often would someone who comes to a bakery come again? And what would be the typical transaction size per visit? That would be a decomposition. Generally, and there's been research on this, but generally, if you can break down highly uncertain things in a few basic variables like this, generally your estimate improves. Your estimate becomes more accurate in terms of the forecast. So that's a Fermi decomposition. And the confidence intervals, specifically the subjective confidence intervals, those are a good measure of how much you know now. So if you say, well, I don't know what percentage of the population would actually visit my bakery, but I believe it's somewhere between 5% and 20% of the households would eventually visit my bakery sometime over the next quarter. That would be a representation of your current state of uncertainty. Now, maybe you would have said 10 to 15% and had a much narrower estimate, a very accurate estimate. That would be hard to imagine that a small business just starting out would have that much certainty. More likely, it would be something like 1% to 30%. It'd be a very wide range. So yeah, that's the confidence intervals are important. I would actually introduce another concept. There's 3 things that I call measurement maxims in the book. And well, the first 3 of the measurement maxims are: assume it's been measured before. No matter what you're measuring in a small business, just assume it's been measured before and try to do some research to find out who measured it, how they measured something, or if they measured something similar, what techniques did they use? Because there's a good chance that will turn out to be true. A lot of people start measurements assuming that they're the first people on the planet in the history of the world ever to try to measure that thing. And if you do a little bit of research, you find out that that's rarely true. You may win a Nobel Prize someday for measuring something that's never been measured before, but chances are you won't. You'll measure something that's really pretty routine in some industry. Secondly, we remind people that there's probably more data than they think. They probably have more data than they think. They often think they don't have enough data to measure something. But if you're resourceful, how do you have more data? If a bakery's starting up in this small town, how do they have more data than they think? Well, does the Chamber of Commerce have something? Does the Department of Commerce at the federal level, does it have data about the failure rates of bakeries? Did somebody write their PhD dissertation within the last 5 years about the success rates of bakeries in small towns? You don't know until you look, right? And finally, the third one was, or the third of the measurement maxims was, you probably need less data than you think. A lot of people do a lot of hand-wringing about, I'm not sure I have enough data. But when we actually do the math, people are often surprised by what kind of inferences they can make from apparently small amounts of data. If you have a lot of uncertainty, a few data points will greatly reduce that uncertainty.
Yeah, the other thing that strikes me is that oftentimes people also think they need complete data. when incomplete data will suffice to get you, maybe not all the way there, but at least closer.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, the simple example I come up with is when physicists measured the speed of light, they didn't actually measure all the photons, right?
Right.
They measured a sample of them. And if somebody says, well, those are much more uniform, I say, well, look at when we measure things like income levels. They don't actually survey everybody every month, right? Mm-hmm. Or unemployment levels. They don't survey everybody every month. They sample thousands of people, but it's usually a subset. They attempt a random subset. But that's how most science works. Most science is based on randomized samples of much larger populations. And if we do the math right, it turns out we can make all kinds of inferences from small samples of large populations. As counterintuitive as that is to some people, that is true.
So the good news is, of the 4 questions I had, I don't have to ask you question number 2 and number 3 because you've already answered it. The better news is that I can substitute in one of my own questions that I didn't actually write down. And that has to do a little bit with Fermi. And my recollection is that, your typical business student, when they're attacking a problem, will attack it in a very straightforward process way. And they may immediately come to the conclusion that they've run into some kind of a wall that they just can't solve. But, Fermi in particular was particularly good at looking at the entire situation and figuring out that there's kind of more than one way to skin a cat to improve it, and that you can actually kind of help certain people start to frame things differently and think about things differently so that they can get to a Fermi analysis. And by the way, that ends up resulting in, that situation we talked about where, okay, not complete information or not completely correct, but significantly closer to correct than we had been prior.
If the objective is to reduce your uncertainty, Voltaire said perfect is the enemy of the good, right?
Yep.
So some people say, well, I'm highly uncertain, but unless I can get this ideal amount of information, I've effectively learned nothing. That is not true. Mathematics shows that uncertainty reduction, statistics, is incremental. Every few observations allow us to reduce our uncertainty a little bit. Enrico Fermi, just for context for people, he was a Nobel Prize winning physicist and he worked on the Manhattan Project. And so back in the early 20th century, when he was teaching his engineering and science students how to estimate uncertain things as part of his class, this is one of the reasons he was an entertaining professor, he would ask them whimsical things like estimate how many piano tuners are in the city of Chicago.
Ah, yes.
And at first, his engineering and science students, which I assume are all very smart people ending up in Enrico Fermi's class, right, would feel stumped. They would say, how could I possibly know that? Because they're thinking like engineers. They're thinking, unless I have all the data, I know nothing. Well, Enrico Fermi says, well, instead of focusing on what we don't know, let's see what we can infer from what we do know or can get, okay? What's the population of the city? What's the average number of people per household? What percentage of households have pianos? How often does a piano have to be tuned? How many pianos can a piano tuner tune in a day given travel times between pianos, et cetera? And often they would come up with a range. Let's say they'd come up with a range like 40 to 130. And, each student would have their own range like this. And then they would look up some list like Yellow Pages back in those days, or even before Yellow Pages, Guild List, because they're guilds for piano tuners. And they'd find out that the answer was 48 or something, right? Well, the students would be surprised that what they thought they could literally know nothing about, they could make some inferences about. They could put some constraints on their uncertainty based on other things they do know. There's a quote from a Malcolm Gladwell book, Outliers, where I'm paraphrasing a bit, but it's something to the effect that a successful person is someone who spends 20 minutes trying to figure something out that most people give up on immediately. And this is what I see with immeasurables a lot. It's not that someone actually thought about it for 20 minutes and then, out of frustration gave up. They usually very quickly label it as a measurable or intangible and then don't think about it further. So yeah, a little effort goes a long ways.
So because of the fact that I deal with engineers pretty much all the time, I think you just like right now in that answer unlocked a new world for them. You probably also answered the fourth question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case there's something you didn't touch on. And that final question about small business metrics is, how can these particular techniques be valuable to early stage companies in particular?
Right. Well, first off, I think a lot of the research tells us that there's room for humility in decision making and estimation. We should always be skeptical to a certain degree. And this is a little bit of the dilemma for the early entrepreneur, because entrepreneurs by definition are optimistic, visionary people, et cetera, and they have to often fight against the odds. Something may be unlikely, and they're still going to succeed. And a lot of them will fail, but they're going to try it anyway. So maybe they're optimistic, maybe over-optimistic. But there is room for skepticism for the purpose of improving our own decision-making. A lot of research has been done comparing human decision-making in a huge variety of fields to relatively simple statistical models. And the statistical models frequently outperform the human experts in a surprising variety of problems. The prognosis of diseases, recidivism of criminals, who's going to do better in medical school, the failure rates of small businesses. That was actually one. Which sales people are going to be better salespeople, et cetera. In all of these areas, someone who thought that this was a uniquely human endeavor to make a decision about this, that there's no way that an equation could improve on my decades of experience, it turns out that that's wrong. It turns out that the relatively simple statistical models are beating the human experts.
I'm going to chuck in one, but I'm not going to take credit for it because it's actually something that you mentioned to me the other day. And that is that sometimes what is seemingly a small incremental amount can have a large impact based on kind of the law of large dollars. So for example, the ability to reduce fraud by 0.5% or 0.75%, that market change could be in the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars to the company that's doing it. So what I learned from you the other day was that you should really think about the actual impact of the things that you're measuring relative to how you run your business.